All right, everybody wake up. I know it's after lunch. I know you saw a presentation, nothing against the Atlanta Regional Commission, but very technical. But I'm glad to see what they were doing, and actually we're going to get into that to a certain degree in the sense of the IIJA, or the IIJA, and everything. But we're going to be talking specifically as it relates to broadband. So before I sit here and introduce the panel that we have up here today, I want to give a little bit of background as it relates to what the IIJA, or IIJA, is putting out in the sense of money as it relates to broadband. And so I only have to deal with maybe one or two programs, not the 400 that was just mentioned before. But before we get into that, so the question is, what is broadband? That's the question. You hear that term bandied about. What is broadband? And some people think it's a certain type of technology. It's, different things like that. Well, fundamentally, broadband connects people or things through a high-speed data connection. That is fundamentally what broadband is. The question then is, what type of technology do you use in the sense of putting that type of, broadband infrastructure in? So everybody understands what broadband is. It's not a particular piece of technology. People think of fiber, and definitely fiber is used predominantly in the sense of a high-speed connection. But I just want to make everyone understand that it's a little more than just maybe one piece of technology. And people say, well, why do you need broadband? Well, I think it's pretty simple. The pandemic, I think, has made it very clear why you need broadband and why you need a high-speed data connection. Using the net, obviously using the internet at home or for work or for school. Obviously, people talk about social media, streaming movies or music. Those are the usual things people think of in the sense of they think of the internet and broadband. But anyone who's in economic development understands this. It's more than just the internet. The analogy I like to use on this, very simply, is if you go back to the early 20th century, in comparison to where we are in the early 21st century, the broadband, you might say, in the sense of economic important infrastructure, was called an electrical grid in the early 20th century. And if you didn't have an electrical grid, you were done from an economic development standpoint. Industry, people were not going to move to your community. So the point of that being is local governments, if you notice, why is there a lot of municipal-owned electric corporations or things like that? Well, there was a reason, was because those communities understood that they didn't have that infrastructure, and for whatever reason the private sector wasn't going to provide it to them. They had to figure out if they were going to be competitive economically. Well, that's a good analogy to look at today as it relates to broadband. If you don't have that infrastructure, this critical infrastructure, and your ability to communicate, trade data, anything to do with business, not just I get faster service to download movies at home. I'm not saying that's not important, folks, but that fundamentally is why I think people to put it fully in focus of why this infrastructure is the critical infrastructure of the 21st century. So I just wanted to kind of make that point. It'd be like the old days. If you were bypassed by the railroad or the interstate, usually those communities didn't do well. Well, you didn't have an electrical grid, you didn't do well either. That's going to be the same thing now. If you do not have broadband, you're not going to do well competitively for both just economically for your community, but also for your citizens. So what I want to talk about very quickly is the slide that you see up here. And I'm sorry for those folks sitting on that side. You're more than happy to come over here if you really want to see this slide. It's something we put together at the Foresite group to explain the mechanics of the BEAD grant. And so what is BEAD? Well, that's one of those programs that they were just mentioning, the 400, that stands for Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment. That's what BEAD stands for. It's important to listen to what they're saying. Equity, access. So if you're going to go after money here, listen to the point of equity and access is going to be important. And that is, a total of $65 billion is what you're going to have in that program for broadband. Of that $65 billion, $45 billion is going to be used specifically for really deployment of infrastructure. $20 billion is going to be a mixture of different types of providing basically assistance to folks in the sense of being able to access broadband, in the sense of being able to afford it. But $45 billion is what we're probably going to be talking about today, and how do you go after that money and those challenges that you need to overcome to be able to be ready to access that money. So example, I'm not going to get into some of the other things. There's rural broadband, there's reconnect, there's tribal, there's middle mile infrastructure, digital equity. These are some of that money that we're talking about, but most of that, bead is most of that money. So at this point, before we kind of get going, I'm going to introduce the panel here. I do want to talk about very quickly how this is working as of now, what's happened since the law was passed last November. So every state has gotten $100 million already has been assigned to them from that $45 billion. So that's $5 billion, doing simple math. 4 territories each have gotten $25 million, so that's another $100 million there. So at this point, the way this is going to work, each state is going to get the money, and there's going to be a formula produced to understand, besides the $100 million they got, how much more money they're going to get. And in Georgia, that agency that's going to be dealing with that specifically is going to be the Georgia Technology Authority. And each state is going to have a broadband development office. They can determine what that's going to be in each state. Could be, let's say, a Department of Community Affairs or whatever they decide. And basically, they're going to be requesting money from the National Telecommunication and Information Administration, another acronym that everybody needs to learn. You never knew we had that, probably most folks. It's been around a while. They're going to be administering this money. And so how does each state decide, and how are we going to decide how each state gets how much money they're going to get? And it's going to be very simple. The FCC is coming out with a map in November that's going to be looking at what you call unserved and underserved areas. And they're going to be looking at speeds, because this new law sets new standards on the speed of service, that it has to be a minimum standard as you put out this new infrastructure. And based on this matrix that's being created, that will determine how much each state is going to get beyond the $100 million they got originally. So it's really going to be based on the amount of unserved and underserved areas in the state will determine how much money each state will get. So basically, the way this is going to work, state and local governments, obviously, you're going to get the money, but local governments will be able to apply for these funds from the state. And real important, that we need to talk about is you better have a pre-deployment plan. Basically, we call it a broadband master plan at Foresite. Just like you have a master plan for anything in your community. You better have a plan of how you're going to, put in this infrastructure. If you do not have that, there's no need to apply. They're not going to be interested in your application. This will not be going directly to private businesses. You can look at public-private partnerships, but this is going through government entities and agencies and political subdivisions of a state. And there's going to be a match. You're going to have a 25% match. A little bit of that, if you look up here, is you can actually use your ARPA funds, by the way. This has actually been cited by the Treasury Department. You can, if you still have ARPA money you have not, put out or committed, I should say at this point, you can actually use your federal dollars to match your federal dollars. Something a little different. So at this point, what this all boils down to is, when you're dealing with these issues, is what are the timelines related to the award, the payout, the project start dates, project completion dates, and all those issues. And I think we're going to have the panel talk about this in a little more detail, and I'm going to be asking some questions to address these issues. And of course, we are going to open it up, and I do want folks to ask questions. Do not go to sleep on me, okay? And so I want to introduce Donna Unger, who's the Vice President of NGN Fiber and the President of Fiber Network Owners Alliance, Donna. And also Mark Metcalf, who's the Principal Founder of the Teton Telecom. And Stephen Stewart, he's the CEO of SmartBroadband. And then finally, Lee Comer, my colleague, who is the Broadband Engineering Practice Area Leader at Foresite Group. So I'm going to get this kicked off, guys. And first of all, are your microphones working?
Test.
All right. Well, apparently we didn't want to hear from him anyway. I don't know. So let me ask the first question. Actually, I'm going to direct this to Mark. So you got a good microphone?
Got a good microphone.
All right. It's a very simple question. How does this compare to previous federal funding that we've had before? And I mean, I can list off a whole names here, but we had Reconnect USDA, we had Connect America Fund, RDOF, ARPA.
I think that's a great question, and thanks for asking
Yeah.
it. I think one of the biggest things that we've noticed is they're pushing it down to the states to administer this. That's a really big deal from my perspective. I think Georgia, and I work with a lot of different states, Georgia's done a really good job of organizing. You would be proud of GTA. They've done a very good bipartisan job of getting ahead of things, getting their submittals in time. They're going to lead this effort. So it seems that the states have a better idea of their problems and their problem areas. So that's one of the big unique offerings of this one. Also the amount of money. This is, Doug mentioned it earlier, this is generational money. It's much like the electricity rollout in the early 1900s. We'll never see money like this again towards broadband, and I think it's really important that cities and counties and municipalities understand that. This is really a generational opportunity to change the complexion of your municipality and take advantage of it.
No, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. The one thing I want to kind of restate again, the focus of this panel. Now, they use the term obstacles. I like to use the term challenges. Obstacles just sound so negative. But challenges related to financing and implementation of broadband access to rural, suburban, and urban communities. That's what we're going to talk about. How does this $45 billion address these issues? So, one of the biggest issues is the digital divide. That's part of this discussion too, the digital divide. And that's why remember what I said about BEAD, equity and access. That's obviously talking about the digital divide. So I'm going to ask Stephen. All right. I guess the question is, what have you seen about broadband disparity across, rural, suburban, and urban communities from your experience? Where is the digital divide, in other words?
Well, it's funny you mention that. Most people think of digital divide as rural, these one streetlight towns, but actually it's really everywhere. It's urban. One thing that we talked about with NTIA and their definition of underserved is not just speeds, but it's also access and devices. So as we look at the needs or access, it's speeds, it's understanding of how to use these technologies. So there are a lot of ways. I didn't know if you had my slide up. I couldn't see.
I'm trying to see if I can get this slide.
Okay,
I'm having some problems.
Okay, I can talk to it. So
Yeah.
we use what's called the Quad A approach. So we look at 4 areas. We look at access, which is pretty straightforward. We look at availability. If you only have a mobile device in your home, you're not going to have a real internet experience, right? You're not going to be able to go out to Google Earth or do cool stuff, right, just through a mobile device. We look at availability as well. I said access, availability, affordability, and adoption. And I think adoption is the real key word here. So if you look at how the IIJA is structured, it's not just connecting, it's what I do with this connectivity, right? So it's no real value for me to say, oh, I got better speeds and a $35 a month internet bill. What are the opportunities that now I can take advantage of, right? So, I used this example in Mississippi the other day. I might be the most charismatic influence in the world, but why not reap the benefits of that? Or why am I not able, from an equity access perspective, not able to, have 1 million followers just because I live in a rural town as opposed to living in Atlanta or something? So that's how we look at, so our company, we basically look at equity inclusion in those kind of 4 veins, and believe it or not, it applies everywhere. You can apply this method to rural city of Atlanta and anywhere else, and that's pretty much how the IIJA is going to come out. So it's access, availability, affordability, and adoption. So once you put together these great plans, and once you actually decide, the direction and where you're going, think about what you're going to do in the future, right? Think of what that access is now going to mean to these communities, right?
Well, on that point, I guess, the next question is, and what are some of the key ways that you can make broadband affordable? Again, going back to what BEAD stands for, equity and access, for consumers, and also improve digital literacy. And, on that issue, maybe Donna, you can talk about access and everything, and I think we're going to use your microphone.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, go ahead, Donna.
Okay, thank you. So when you think about access, the first thing that right out of the gate you think about is deploying more physical infrastructure. And I think it's very important. I think with the amount of money that's coming down the pipe, we have some incredible opportunities to build out in rural areas. As you mentioned earlier, I am the president of the Fiber Network Owners Alliance. Mm-hmm. And for most of you that do not know what that means, is we are a group of more than 50 companies where municipalities, EMCs, ISPs, data centers, rural telephone companies that have come together and formed a strategic alliance to try to tackle the issue or the lack of broadband in rural communities. And so we've been doing this for many, many years, and you can imagine when we heard how much money is coming down the pipe to further this, we're super excited. We know that this is going to make a difference, but we also know, as you had mentioned, not an obstacle, but there are some challenges that are associated with this. Several of those challenges, well, to start with is, again, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been out here building out the fiber networks in these rural areas, into the mountains of North Georgia, over into Blue Ridge territory. So you can sit out on Lake Raven and have internet speeds as fast as those in these metropolitan cities around the world. So we have fiber there. But one of the concerns that we're seeing right now is, as these grants come down and that the money is awarded, is we're seeing a lot of overbuild from incumbents in our area. That's not what this money was intended for. This money was intended to reach further than what we could do and actually reach deeper into the pockets of these communities and build where there's no access at all.
Well, to your point, that's why this formula on the money that the states are going to get is based on unserved and underserved areas. They're not interested in building to markets where the service is already provided. And you may have pockets, to your point,
right,
in these more urbanized areas and suburban areas, but
yeah,
that's not what the intention of this money is for.
it's true.
I was going to ask about availability. Stephen, maybe you can address it. It says, the point of this is just in the sense, you made a comment about it earlier,
Yeah,
about
I did.
availability and everything.
Right. So, and I've seen, and I don't know your experience, but even with, and I know you'll talk about this in detail later, but I was surprised with even the ACP program. It was just the program, the devices were not, I think I talked to one large carrier and, yeah, we got the ACP program, but not the devices, right? So to your point about availability, the experience, what we've seen when we do our assessments is we can kind of tell where there might be a lack of devices because we might see a whole bunch of 5G densification in that area, right? Because most folks in those communities are using their cell phone. So guess what? Not only are they using their cell phone, the parents are probably using the cell phone. The kids are using that same cell phone. So availability is a big metric to this, right? So, you want to have that shared experience of, a great broadband connection. So availability and lack of availability is a huge driver.
Well, the next thing on that, and we're kind of doing the A's, you kind of reference is affordability issues. And again, that's, again, what BEAD, equity, and that's what that's referring to, and access is, I think, Mark, you might have some thoughts on that as it relates to affordability challenges.
Yeah, and I think Stephen made a good point. The ACP program really standing that up and educating the communities. And unfortunately,
You might want to explain the ACP.
it's Affordable Connectivity Program.
Yeah, there you go.
And what that does is it provides certain citizens a discounted rate for internet so that it's equal speeds to everyone. It's a great program. But unfortunately, a lot of the public is not educated about it. Something like, I think 60% of Nashville could qualify and is not taking advantage of it. That's one of the outliers. But without a doubt, you have citizens in your community that qualify for these programs and they're not taking advantage of it. I'd say that again. You have citizens that could be paying $30 a month for a gig and they're not taking advantage of it. It's getting that information out, that educating our citizens so that they know their options. It's messaging, really. And it's, a lot of that comes back to the municipality, the county, the city. So the programs are there. It's really a matter of educating the citizens on these programs, getting them
Adoption, in other words, is your
Adoption,
point.
yes,
Yeah,
sir.
adoption in the sense of getting folks to, as you said, educate and adopt. I guess the next thing is, when you talk about this, is what are some ways to promote and expedite this? And I'm actually going to ask my colleague Lee Comer, and maybe you want to expand on that issue about the challenges of ways to promote and expedite.
Sure. So we've talked about ways of getting the service, and then what could you do with it if you have it. But the first step is that access point. Hence, that's in the name of the BEAD program. So when we start looking at access, that means having the infrastructure out in front of your house or your business, that actual physical connection that you can put services across. So a few things that we should be seeing, and these are things that we want to promote in the industry, working with public officials, the private sector. One key thing is, and we just touched on this, is let's mitigate waste. These are large sums of tax dollars that we haven't paid for yet. These are future dollars we're going to be spending, so let's invest them well and smartly. So not overbuilding, I think, is one key aspect. We don't need to go build infrastructure where that infrastructure already exists. That's not sensible. And you may have the argument, well, what about competition? Well, competition is great in the private space. These are public dollars. So we need to put on a different hat and look through a different lens. Well, similar to that, not just through repetition, but how can you be smarter about the way you build out this network to create that first step, which is access? So joint use is a great potential. If you think about building a water system, replacing water mains, or a gas system, and that's part of infrastructure, that's part of IIJA bill. Well, if you're going to open that right-of-way, why can't you put more than one thing in that right-of-way? You're really building multiple things with the same construction. You're reducing this by a factor of 0.8 for the cost of a build. You're cutting 80% off of a secondary build if you join it with the first build. So there's ways that we can do that are just a lot smarter ways to design and build. And if you think about if I'm opening that right-of-way or if I'm making an attachment, it's a single permit. So I'm reducing multiple permitting. I'm opening that street only one time, like a dig once policy. It's just much more efficient and it's a smarter way to do things. So while we're talking about efficiencies, some other things that we need to look at to promote all of these different Quad A processes is once you build a network, how can you utilize that network more intelligently? And at the end of the day, all of this comes back to money. We can talk about all the great ideas and the things that we love and we have passion for, but we have to pay for it, and it has to pay for itself eventually. And we got this great opportunity to get this funding, but once you've built that network, we're looking immediately at internet access. And again, this really drove from COVID. Kids trying to do homework at home, people working at home, that's really the thing that lit the fuse. But we need to look way beyond that. So if you look at that network, the access point, and you look at the services that can go on that network, and you think about the different consumers that use that network, well, it is people, it's residences, it's businesses, but it's also cell towers, it's sensors and switches, it's monitors, it's cameras, It's intelligent traffic systems. So you'll hear the phrase open access, and that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But the key fundamental aspect is once you build that one network, what else can you do with it? It's not just internet access to a home. It can be used for lots of other things, including smart city applications, utility switching and monitoring. If you think about telemedicine devices in the home, where a doctor's at the other end and you're actually using it, not just web conferencing, but actual devices. That's a different kind of connection that may not be internet-based. But the cool thing is when you start to put those kind of open access networks together, that's multiple points of revenue generation for that network owner. So now the business model makes more sense. And that's why we're here, because previously the business model didn't work. So we have to be really innovative and intentional about being smarter of how we're going to make this investment count for us.
Well, a good point of that. $45 billion sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, this is really just a down payment. This is not going to provide the amount of it's not providing broadband to everybody in the country, but no matter where they live. It's kind of seeding in a substantial way to begin this process and everything. So to your point, you need to be open to basically, what type of business plan, and that's the point of how you, and that may be public-private partnerships, of how do you take this money and leverage it and extend it. So on that issue, and this is deployment challenges that we're talking about, and maybe Mark, I'll ask you on this is, if you're a community that doesn't usually spearhead broadband programs, which by the way, pretty much is everybody. This is, telecommunications has not been a public sector, that was Ma Bell, for those who remember what Ma Bell was. That was Ma Bell's job. That wasn't, local systems do water, they do the transportation, parks and recs, they'll even have an electrical or gas company, right? Telecommunications, I don't know what that's about. And so the point is that, who's going to be responsible for pursuing the funding? What should they be considering? In other words, what are these challenges, Mark, in the sense they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, thanks. I think most importantly, it's developing a broadband plan. Frankly, a lot of cities and counties, municipalities react to these grants and they develop a plan really around the grant. And that a lot of times that can set you up to fail. Frankly, it's more about setting up a sustainable broadband plan and then using these grants to supplement it, to subsidize it. That's a much more solid approach, and picking the right partners. Now is really that time. BEAD's going to be, it's looking like Q3 of next year, so you do have some time to prepare, but there's a lot to be done. You've got to design a network, you've got to identify your areas of concern, understand where you need to go first. A lot of instances you're going to need to do speed tests. The cities and the Fed have done a good job of trying to understand where the slow speeds are and where the high speeds are, but frankly, it's the ISPs that are providing that information. So just checking those, doing speed tests, doing surveys with your citizens to understand, are they really getting the speeds that are reflected in the maps? Because that could hurt you from being able to obtain some of these grant proceeds, because it's reflecting your area as being served, and frankly, it's not. The other piece of that is resources, and we run into this with a lot of rural ISPs, a lot of rural clients, and that's, they don't have the lobby resources, the grant writing resources to go up against some of these larger ISPs that are taking a big chunk of the money, frankly. So,
yeah, an ISP is Internet Service Provider, just so everybody.
Sorry, it's an acronym world, and we use a lot of them, so I apologize for that. But yeah, I mean, it's really getting together a solid plan, finding the right partners early on, and working through those plans. RFIs are great, understanding who's out there, who can help, and just working within the industry.
Well, I think the point you're making, so like if you're building a water system, I mean, I just use this as an example, and the point you're making is you want a self-sustaining system, okay? I mean, that's what you need to be thinking about, is how does this network sustain itself? I mean, do you charge fees? How do you redo that? Just like you do with a water system or a natural gas system, or whatever else you're doing, in the sense of that type of infrastructure. And to that point, I'd maybe ask you, Stephen, what are some of the challenges you see from say a program planning side?
Well, the first thing I see is people try to figure out where to get money from, right? How to make that investment. We know most municipalities don't have discretionary funds, so I'd say the challenge is, figuring out what that procurement process is to begin the plans, right? To bring in Teton or Foresite Group to begin this work. The other challenge we see a lot is understanding timelines. We do have a pretty significant window for bead responses, but that planning needs to begin now. I'll share a funny story. I think I called Mark, about a week ago? Somebody trying to respond to a middle mile for a major city and wanted to get it done in 25 days. So basically, why spend that time and investment and you haven't properly prepared? So understanding timelines is very important. And I think the third thing is, every municipality, every city has a master plan, a comprehensive plan. As we go out and look at these broadband initiatives, make sure you tie that into those plans, right? So, it's not just about connectivity. You're building new roads, buildings. There are opportunities for you to, make sure that as you build out and plan builds that you provide broadband, right? So we're looking at broadband as infrastructure. So I'd say those are the two or the three important things to consider when planning.
And on that point, I guess one of the other things is, okay, so you decided you're going to go do this. What are some of the challenges for network construction and ownership? And maybe Donna, because obviously you deal in that area, might want to address what some of those issues
Yeah, thank
that you're going to
you.
need to deal with.
Absolutely. I think what I'm about to say is not a surprise to anyone in the room, but I think one of the first challenges that we have and have had as of COVID is labor. I see an improvement. I see that we are, folks are getting back out and coming back to work, but there's still some challenges there. And in addition to that, in terms of labor in some of these rural communities, you're going to need skilled labor in terms of engineers, planners, project managers, also equipment, bucket trucks, boring rigs, splice trucks, you name it. Most of those are a year out. We're on a wait list right now for equipment. Same thing as far as supplies are concerned, fiber optic cable, vaults, whatever. We're having to order a year. We have to project or forecast out a year or more and order those things today so that we'll have the materials and the equipment that we need when we do get, the money to build out and continue to expand. So I think some of those are the biggest challenges that we're facing right now in terms of construction.
Well, the good news, I won't say the good news, but the point of this is, yes, the money is going to come, and it's going to be a while, just like on all these programs where, this is talking about getting ready, planning, and all that. Hopefully, by the time you're ready to actually go into the field, hopefully some of these supply side, issues have been resolved or they're in better shape. But it's good to know that those are challenges you're going to have to deal with. And then really, and that's the point about, that's the issue that, everyone's facing. But like I said, again, hopefully by the time we get there, some of those issues will be resolved. I guess, Lee, I'm going to ask you, what do you see as the challenges from a design, engineering, consulting perspective?
So I'm going to reverse order that. So
Yeah,
we
that's
start
fine.
off in the consulting space.
Yeah.
And I did come from the design engineering world, but has led me into the consulting space where we're working with cities and counties and multi-county regions and states at some level. Part of this is having that relationship in place. There's so many things that don't happen in the same space, that conversations don't come together. There's a lot of breakdown in communication. So first off, as a community, if you're representing that community or you're supporting that community, get everybody that needs to be in that room together. But once you do that, you need to develop a plan. And we kind of laugh a lot of times in the public space, things move really slowly. Well, you don't need to make rash decisions, but you don't need to just be standing still the whole time. You do need to have some positive forward movement. We have some deadlines ahead of us, so getting the right people together, moving things forward. And then once you get into the more of the engineering design aspect, it's not that cumbersome to design a fiber network per se, but in order to get that to a buildable place, you've got to submit underground permits, or you've got to put pole applications in. So you're working with infrastructure owners and right-of-way owners. So if you're working with a city or a county, They already own that right-of-way. They control that right-of-way. There should be some processes implemented on the very front end to benefit yourself as that public entity. Blanket permitting is a great way of doing things. Having a good relationship with the pole owner is fantastic. That's a huge issue today. So finding smarter ways, again, it's about being smart and efficient to promote these things, using that public space, pushing those things along, having that plan in place, implementing that plan. And I like the phrase, plan the work, work the plan. A lot of folks that start these larger projects, because we're not talking about building out a subdivision, we're talking about building out a city or a county or a multi-county region. You can't get a third of the way through and go, hey, let's change our minds. No, you got to set a goal and you got to hit that goal. And you can do something different later, but if you don't have a goal that you're going to go attain, you will get nowhere and you'll just waste time and money.
And that's the point of why you better have a plan when you go apply for this money, because that's the question, just any type of, be it federal or state dollars, is what are you going to do with this money? Not during the ARPA thing, and I won't mention states or anything, but you had situations where people were showing up and said, give us the money, we'll figure it out later. And seriously, that was trying to get the money out the door. Well, that is not going to happen with the BEAD program. And they're going to know how you want to spend that money, so you better stick to your plan. I guess the next thing, one of the other issues is, and maybe Donna, is mapping, and what we mean by this is that this has to do with network owners, maybe do not have very good data. It maybe be I'll let you comment on that as a network owner.
Yeah, we were fortunate when we started our company years ago. That was something that we recognized that was going to be very important for today and for the future. Unfortunately, that's not the case, with everyone, especially in some of the cities. A lot of folks, they know where they know where everything's at, but it's up here. It's not on paper. It's not in a system. It's nowhere to be found. So definitely some challenges there. I do think what's going to help us, though, and you had mentioned it before, is this fabric map that the FCC's been working on, and that's going to be released soon. I think that just understanding where unserved and the underserved areas actually are. I don't think this is going to be the finite, the be-all. I think that it's going to be a whole lot better than where we're at today, but I think that we're going to have to continue to work on that as time goes by. But I do think that just working together with our local communities and just trying to determine, where the utilities are at, get this into a system somewhere, being of service as we can, working with local GIS offices, all of that's going to be very important.
Well, to that point, George is not the only one, but I would say George is ahead of the game, where the state several years ago decided that they needed to figure out what services we had, in the sense of what speeds, and nothing against any of the private providers, but what they're marketing on television and what your actual speed is may be two different things. and that's part of what the state has been doing, and of course the FCC, but particularly the state of Georgia has been doing over the last several years, and they finally have gotten that information together, which will help determine.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we participated in that as well. I mean,
Right.
like I said, it's a huge step, and we're moving in the right direction. And I think eventually we're going to know exactly where we're at.
So let me ask you this, Lee. What our teams need to be doing now in preparation?
So we mentioned that pre-deployment plan. As we're doing this in Foresite, we call it a broadband master plan, and it's really 3 phases. Phase 1 is going in, doing assessment, understanding what kind of infrastructure is in your community, and that tells you what kind of infrastructure is not in your community. Part of that is actually doing what we call a demand aggregation, which is where people in the community can go to a website, answer some survey questions, and run a speed test. We can capture all that data. So going back to that fabric mapping, this is granular data down to the household. And it's a good way to model what's really happening out there. So that market assessment is kind of a phase 1. Mark talked about this, and a phase 2 is designing that network that's going to augment and solve for the gaps. So we need to understand, what's this going to cost to build, what's it going to cost to operate it and maintain it. And then once we move past that, phase 3 is looking at the business plan. Okay, we know what the expenses are, so what does the revenue projection look like? And once you can start to figure out what that's going to look like, from either residential consumers getting internet access, leasing this to a power company for SCADA systems, getting the governmental entities, connecting EMA, fire, police, government locations, whatever the case may be. Those are revenue generating points on that network. So now that you can build a pro forma, okay, now we have a legitimate plan. It's not a detailed design. It's not something you can go do tomorrow, but it does get you in a position where you can move towards applying for grants, moving into RFPs, establishing those partner relationships, because this is not going to be done by any one entity. This is going to be done by the public entity, the county, the city, whomever that is, private investment, and then augmented with federal funding. So you got to have all those things together into that strategy. And from a timeline perspective, you mentioned it's going to be probably Q3. So they're forecasting to get new mapping out in the middle of November. And then 180 days past that is when the applications have to be submitted. And typically, any kind of a real legitimate pre-deployment plan is going to take about 6 months. So we're getting close right now that if you're not engaged, you're going to be scrambling. And so we're trying to get the word out there that, this is a future investment, but you got to start planning today.
Tell you what, I'm going to kind of stop there in the sense of questions have been asked in the panel. I want to ask if anyone in the audience has a question. And speak up loud. My hearing's not that good. Now we've thrown all this at you, so I expect someone's got to have a question. Yes, ma'am. So let me make sure, I want to repeat your question. You're asking how public schools are engaging as it relates to this infrastructure?
Well, for the other way around,
Other,
the sector
oh,
finding public schools as a way, and obviously he's very excited.
okay, I'll let Lee
Yes.
answer the question. Go ahead and
And
answer that question,
We
Mark.
were actually having this
Tell me the
conversation at lunch, so it's great timing. Frankly, there has been a system in place through E-rate. It's about a $3 billion annual program that goes towards schools' connectivity. You can build full wide area networks for public schools in Georgia. It's a great program. A lot of companies are starting to do more of it. The problem now is coordination between your cities and your school districts. They're not talking enough. They're not overlaying their needs enough. So you have school districts going out looking to build a brand new network all over the school district, and then you've got cities looking to build city networks, and they're not talking. That's a problem. The good thing is if you have a new company come in and build a brand new network for the school, they're going to put in additional fiber. They're going to want to monetize that in other ways. So the ability for housing authorities or municipalities or other entities to participate in that program and get a low cost to entry fiber is very real. It's really a matter of communication and understanding what your school system's doing and what their needs are.
Mm-hmm. You're putting in a trunk line, and then you can, other people can access that infrastructure
Yes.
and everything. Other questions? Over here, I'm sorry. So to your point, and I'll make sure I encapsulate that, you're asking, is there other, in a sense of beyond just internet service, what are the other potential uses of the broadband that relates in connection and conversation going on between different technologies, be it an electric vehicle and things like that? Someone want to kind of make a comment on that, Lee?
I'd love to answer that one.
Yeah, Lee, this is Lee's favorite one, by the way,
Yeah.
if you haven't noticed.
So you asked, will it impact it? It's not just will it impact it, it's foundational to it. These things are not going to happen on their own. So the conversations earlier today, a lot about EV. So you're going to have to increase the grid. You're going to open the right-of-way to get more power grid in place. That's a great opportunity to get more conduit for more fiber in place. Well, hey, I'm going to drive my EV to a location, and I'm going to charge it between 25 and 45 minutes. Well, what am I going to do while I'm there? So broadband connectivity at that location is going to be key for that application. Plus, somebody talked earlier about, we're not going to be working on cars as much, but we can move workforce development to other things like carrying and maintaining these EV stations. Well, you need sensing and monitoring and switching at the EV station. All of these things require connectivity. So we talked about broadband, the very first thing. That's not just internet. That's a subset of broadband. It's everything connected. Your home, your computer, your cell phone, your pet, your shoes, your car, everything. And I'm being legitimate. Everything will be connected where you're having some kind of a feedback sensor relationship connection. So all of these infrastructure elements are going to be a part of that. And it doesn't make any sense to do any of these things in a silo. If you're looking at power, water, gas, roads, sidewalk, healthcare, voting, whatever the case may be, broadband's going to touch that in some way, shape, or form.
Too, I think we're going to wrap it up here. I think we actually run a little bit over our time. But I want to appreciate y'all coming today. I appreciate everyone having some good questions. Obviously, we're still going to be here. Happy to talk to anybody else. And obviously, our information is in the program. If you have more questions you would want to ask any of us here, you know how to get hold of us and everything. Thank y'all again.